Okay, Caroline, Syria is in the news this week around the world. Can you tell me why it is and what the latest news with the country is from the experience of Oxfam?
Well, basically, you've seen Syria back in the news the last couple of days because the Syrian people and organisations like ourselves are marking a decade since the conflict began in Syria. And although the headlines have very much faded in countries like Ireland and across Europe, the humanitarian crisis is continuing there, and it's continuing to cause tremendous human suffering to people still in Syria, but also the people who had to flee Syria. So I guess our concern is we're marking this moment because we're worried that this is going to become another forgotten crisis. And just because the headlines, aren't there doesn't mean that the situation has been resolved or that people have found the peace that they so desperately need.
You must find it very disappointing in Oxfam days that Syria most of the time is faded from the news.
Well, we do, and as part of our activities over the last week, I did meet with a lot of Syrians who now call Ireland home. And for them, this is still an ongoing crisis. Many of them still have family in Syria. And then in addition to that, they may have their family, their kind of core family units spread right across Europe or in other places like Jordan and Lebanon. So just to kind of give people an idea, today there's about 13 million Syrian people still in need of humanitarian assistance. Many of them are still living in crowded camps or in overly kind of populated urban dwellings. They don't have basic infrastructure, especially when you're thinking about the global pandemic that we've all been living through the last year. People are really, really struggling to survive. So they estimate about 3 million people in Syria now have some form of disability or lifelong impairment due to a combination of the hostilities and obviously a decimated health system after the years of war. And hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost to the conflict. Because of bombing and shelling, essential infrastructure, when you think about schools, hospitals, homes have been destroyed, and lives basically still remain on hold. So a lot of people kind of expressing that they thought that, once maybe the hostilities died down, that they would be safer or that life would get a bit better, but they're actually now finding themselves in an even more difficult situation because they are struggling to even provide food to feed their children.
And I read something about this during the week. I can just clarify for have we, the Irish people, the Irish government, accepted our quota of refugees from Syria, or are there still more to come over, or what's the story, do you know?
Ireland isn't, I guess, the worst offender, but we would be of the mind that there's still more we can do. So the commitments that Ireland would have made back in 2015, we opted into both the EU's ask to accept people under the relocation programme. So that would be accepting people from countries like Greece and Italy, and the resettlement programme, which Ireland has a long track record and history of participation in. So it was positive that Ireland opted into those two requests because we didn't have to. And under resettlement in particular, a lot of Syrian people and families have been brought to Ireland. But obviously the need is still there. Families are remaining quite separated. So you may have people who have their refugee status here in Ireland, but still have family members in places like Jordan, Lebanon, or indeed Greece. And they continue to live lives apart, and they've very little options. So the things I guess we're asking for the Irish government is to meet the commitments that it has made under relocation and resettlement, increase numbers when it's feasible to do so. I do appreciate at the moment the pandemic throws up more obstacles and more challenges. Everything isn't as straightforward as it should be. And the other thing we're asking for is for the Irish government to make amendments to our family reunification legislation. So when the government changed our asylum legal framework, I think it was back in 2017, they also changed how they define who constitutes a family member. So when a person has refugee status in Ireland, just so people know, they have a legal right to apply for immediate family members to join them in the country that they've got their refugee status in. So before the government changed the legal framework, that would have included your partner, dependents such as maybe children. It could extend to nieces or nephews, and elderly grandparents or parents. So when the definition changed, it meant that your partner, basically you had to be married to them before you were forced to flee. The dependents you could apply for are just your children under the age of 18. So if your children have turned 18, say during the last 10 years of conflict in Syria, they aren't eligible under the current legal framework. And it also excludes elderly dependents you may have, such as your parents or grandparents. So it's a very narrow definition of what we would all think of when we think of our immediate family. And it means that families remain separated, remain unable to reunite. And it's one little thing we could be doing to add to the numbers that we have welcomed to date, and to give people the peace they need and the peace of mind they need to really properly settle and integrate and try to forge a life here and move on. Because when people are still worrying day in and day out for family members who are still in Syria or in Lebanon and Jordan, it's really, really difficult for them to be able to settle properly here and move on with their lives.
And Caroline, are Oxfam, are you able to actually, are you working in Syria at the moment, or is the conflict mean you're not allowed to work in the country, or what's the story?
We are. We have colleagues who are based in Damascus at the moment. So a lot of the work that we'd be involved in would be the provision of clean water and the rehabilitation of water infrastructure. So, like as I mentioned, a lot of essential services and infrastructure were destroyed during the last 10 years. So we're looking at rebuilding, repairing, also bringing water trucks to communities that wouldn't have clean or access to clean water otherwise. We would also be distributing, and obviously since COVID hit, we've really had to ramp up our response. So distributing hygiene kits, cash transfers to the most vulnerable families, as well as providing kind of information and resources to communities about, precautions to be taken in COVID times, and also the symptoms and signs and when to seek medical attention if you need it. In addition to that, we'd also be providing seeds and seedlings to farmers so people have the ability to grow their own food. So we're doing the same kind of stuff that Oxfam does globally, but obviously the situation within Syria, you've got to say 80% of Syrians are considered to be living below the poverty line. You've got 9.3 million people dependent on food assistance and aid. And I guess that the thing that we were trying to highlight this past week, along with other Irish organisations, is that although, say, the Irish response, the government have been consistently generous in their support of the aid effort, but in a global front, the humanitarian funding just isn't keeping pace with the increasing need in the country.
Okay, Caroline, you already mentioned what you're calling on the Irish government to do. What is it going to take for the civil war in Syria to end and for normality to return to the country, do you think?
I don't have the answer to that, I'm afraid. I think what I can speak to is the people that I have met. What people need is peace. They need to be able to move forward. They need to be able to move forward with their lives safely, because I think the feeling for people now is they're reaching a point where I remember one woman who was quoted in some of the materials we used last week saying she just can't imagine leading a normal life again because it's dragged on so long. And that idea that once the kind of, the conflict, they feel like they've survived the conflict, they've tried to return to their homes, but now they have nothing, and they're still living in this, with this instability, not knowing how they're going to, live day to day. So what Syria needs is peace, and how we reach that point, I guess we still need international support and say with Ireland, now that we are an elected member of the UN Security Council, we have an opportunity there to play an influential role to resolve the crisis. And I know immediate priority for Ireland is ensuring that humanitarian access is protected. So I think at the moment what we need to do in terms of what the public can do is don't forget Syria. Just because you're not reading about it in the newspaper doesn't mean that life has returned to normal for people still living there, or for the people who are now living across Europe and the Lebanon and Jordan. And to keep this in conversation, to raise it with your local TDs, to ensure that Ireland keeps its role, which has been quite positive to date, and just to ensure that this doesn't become another forgotten crisis.